Okay, it's 8:05, so we'll get underway. Good morning. Welcome to the Society for Range Management 2022 annual meeting. Our symposium this morning is about transformational climate change on rangeland. I'm Joel Brown, and I'm your moderator for the symposium this morning. We're recording the meeting, and it will be available later. So don't say or do anything that you don't want preserved for perpetuity. Before we begin, I ask you to turn off your video and mute your microphones. We've got almost 200 people registered for this symposium, and we're going to need all the bandwidth and to minimize the distractions. If you have questions, please use the chat functions, and I'll monitor the chat and address the questions to the speakers to make sure we stay on time. We do have about 30 minutes at the end of the symposium for a more in-depth discussion. We'll take a short break at about an hour and a half to allow everyone to get a cup of coffee and catch up with things. So with that, we will begin. Our first speaker this morning is Dr. Ken Spaeth. Ken is with the NRCS Grazing Lands team in Fort Worth. And Ken is going to talk about evaluation of current rangeland conditions. Ken, it's yours.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Good morning, everybody. As the title says, I want to give you an overview of some of the current rangeland conditions and trends based on non-federal rangeland community types. We're using the National Resource Inventory data set 2004 to 2008. And based on the whole US sample, we have over 30,000 points on the ground now. And so in this presentation, I want to briefly look at some trends based on similarity index, apparent rangeland trend, interpreting indicators of rangeland health, and then we'll look at a couple of resource concerns that kind of dovetail with basic overall trends and conditions from the NRI, and then we'll talk about the need for specific experimentation to sort out any climate change effects on rangelands. Long-term studies are definitely needed. So the NRI, this is what an NRI plot looks like. It's a 0.4 acre macro plot with 250-foot tapes aligned north and south, east and west, and a variety of data is collected on the transects within the macro plot and for the field. So for example, up in the upper left-hand corner, we record any obvious conservation practices that are applied on the site, resource concerns that the field crew sees, and then there's macro plot measurements. We do the rangeland health assessment of the three attributes on the macro plot. We do rangeland trends, census, full census of ID and plants, and assigning a density value to them. And then we record disturbance indicators. Along the transect, a variety of data from plant productivity, canopy cover, soil stability tests, etc., plant heights, pretty in-depth protocols in the field. So we're going to be looking at some ecoregions based on level 3, just to kind of look at some basic trends across the central Great Plains, northern Great Plains, and then we'll move further west into the Colorado Plateau and the Great Basin, just to kind of show you the power of the NRI. We're not going to specifically get into the detail, but I thought I would select some major ecoregion and just basically show you what the NRI is telling us. So for example, with the similarity index, these are there's 4 ecoregions here, basically in the central Great Plains. The upper left, this is the average similarity index for the whole US based on 29,600 points is almost 30%. And then we'll look at, you can see the comparison of these various ecoregions. Note that the Flint Hills and the Nebraska Sand Hills are above 40%. Based on my knowledge and working in these areas, they're largely comprised of native tall grass species like big bluestem, Indian grass, side oats, grama, switchgrass, things like that. They seem to be a lot more resilient than perhaps other species, major grass and forb species that are occupied more of the northern central Great Plains. And so then we move over to the right and we go up further north into 4 ecoregions up closer to North-South Dakota in that area. And just showing you the basic type of data that we can glean from the NRI. And I think it's important to note that, in evaluating any kind of trends or assigning what the effects of climate change or any other kind of disturbances, we need to establish some kind of a baseline of some basic conditions. And that's what I'm doing here is presenting a starting point. Now, the 2 bottom graphs actually represent repeat visits of the samples. For example, if the bars are red, that signifies a significant difference. Now, similar index is based on, basically it's a comparison of the existing plant community production of current year's growth compared to the reference community in an ecological site description. So it's just a mathematical computation of basically the historic plants in the ecological sites. So for the US, there is a slight drop, the high plains a slight drop, and then the green bars in the other 3 ecoregions, there is no significant change. And then we move up further north toward North-South Dakota, eastern Montana, Nebraska, and there's some of the results there. If we move further west into the Wyoming Basin, for example, in the Colorado Plateau, there's kind of a basic average for the whole ecoregion, and then we'll look, and then the right graph actually shows the comparison of a first sample and a second sample, and these samples on the average are 6 years apart from the first visit to the second visit. So for the Colorado Plateau, it's right on the borderline. It just crossed the significance level of 0.05, so it's real borderline. But the Central Basin and Range, there was a significant drop there, even though the percentage maybe only dropped maybe 3 or 4%. It was a significant change. So next we'll look at apparent trend. That's kind of a subjective determination based on whether the plant community is moving away from the historic plant community, or it's not apparent, or it's moving toward. It's just a simple procedure that NRCS uses, and we talk with ranchers about what their trends are. It's typically not followed up with any quantitative measurements in the field, although you can do quantitative measurements based on canopy cover or production and get some kind of a feel for what the apparent trend is. So, just looking at the trend across the US, note that all the values are below 2, between 1 and 2, which is away and not apparent. So actually the trends are not moving toward HPC in any of those ecoregions. And even in the Flint Hills, we had a drop. In the High Plains, we had a drop. apparent trend. And then to the right, we move up a little further north, and you see the same types of data. And then further west into the Wyoming Basin, Northern Basin, this is just an example of what we're seeing in terms of apparent trend on some of these large ecoregions. So now we'll look at rangeland health, and this is just an example of the Central Great Plains. So we subdivided the data into the categories. One, for example, if you're familiar with rangeland health, there's 5 categories. The first one is none to slight departure from reference, to the most extreme to total departure from reference. That's number 5. So that just shows you a histogram of what the data is showing in the Central Great Plains with respect to, say, biotic integrity. So 53% of the acres fell into category 2, which is slight to moderate departure. 11.6% was in the moderate departure range. And then to the right is the soil surface stability attribute, and then below is the hydrologic function. Typically, we see the data for soil surface stability and hydrologic function are always very similar, since they use a lot of the same indicators to determine that attribute. And then there's the map of 27 expands through Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas, and Nebraska. So it's a quite large ecoregion. Okay, so we look at biotic. We're just going to look at biotic integrity across some of these Central Great Plains, and you can see that we're somewhere between none to slight, slight to moderate for these 4 ecoregions. And we move up into the north, and we see the same trends there. So now we look below, and we see whether there was what the difference is between a 6-year period. And in the U.S., the bar is rising, which means that we went from, say, a 1.7 to now 1.9, for example. So we're starting to move more into the middle of slight to moderate departure. And so for the high plains and the Central Great Plains, the situation was moving toward more toward a moderate or slight to moderate departure from the first visit. The Flint Hills, actually, the situation got a little better. In the Nebraska Sandhills, again, the trend is starting to move more toward slight to moderate. And then you see the same situation there, the same types of data for more than Northern Great Plains. And now we'll quickly look at what is going on with most of the West. It's nice to know, for example, in the Wyoming Basin, Colorado Plateau, and Central Basin and Range, there's no significant change between the 6-year period. So this is just showing you the types of things we can look at with the NRI data, but it also establishes, a baseline of what are the current trends. So if we wanted to start monitoring these sites and collecting more information, or designing experiments to look at the effects of management coupled with climate change, coupled with invasive species, and perhaps lack of prescribed burning or things like that. So, when we look at, I guess the question is, with climate change, what could we learn from, say, focused long-term experimental studies? Obviously, we could look at maybe the uncertainty of projected climates. We could look at what was the effect of number 6, for example, greater atmospheric CO2, the results of reduction in perennial plant growth, what's the establishment of non-native invasive species, what's the what is the effect of maybe more altered or more frequent fire regimes. So when you think about climate change and rising CO2, I thought it would just be interesting to quickly look at the evolution of grasslands over the geologic history. So 70 million years ago, members of POAC started to appear in Northern Africa 70 million years ago. And then by 66 million years ago, there were open habit grasslands of both C3 and C4 grasses. And then 56 million years ago, for example, POAC was nearly worldwide in distribution, and then there was well-established 55 million years ago in North America, so forth and so on. I think it's almost impossible to conceive 55 million year history. So if we look at what the development of some different, for example, in central North America, this square here is the first open habit grasslands became well established around 25 million years ago. But if you look at some of the atmospheric CO2 contents, they were 1,500 to 2,000 parts per million at various periods of the development there by this green dot. So I mean, my point is, when we start thinking about climate change, we got to realize that these grasslands and these grass species have seen everything that nature or the environment can throw at it. I mean, and at best, you know, as rangeland managers, we're looking at a window of during our career of maybe 30 to 40 years. So what are the major challenges to U.S. rangelands? Okay, so quickly looking at the resource needs based on the NRI. The number one resource concern based on all the rangelands in the U.S. was noxious and invasive plants, which accounted for almost 60% of the total acres recorded in the NRI said, yes, noxious and invasive plants is an issue. And so then we also look at health and vigor. Almost maybe 45% of the acres sample had a concern about that. We look at the third ranking one, forage quality and palatability, 40% of the acres. So that's showing us what are some of the key resource concerns on our rangeland. So if we look a little deeper, in terms of invasive species, it's not surprising to see that Bromus tectorum, or cheatgrass brome, occurs on over 25% of the acres on non-federal rangeland. And so we'll also look at Kentucky bluegrass, you know, 20 to 22%. We look at smooth brome, and then we look at field brome. Those species are quite prevalent and dominant on a lot of our rangelands. So for example, quick look at a histogram of 3 ecoregions occupying the Northwest glaciated plains, the Great Plains, and the average canopy cover percent of Kentucky bluegrass for these 3 ecoregions was 22%. Okay, let's look at cheatgrass brome. This is for the entire US. The average foliar cover percentage of cheatgrass where it occurs is 16%. And it occurred on 55% of our NRI points. So last but not least, we'll quickly look at what the situation was in terms of trees and shrubs. Okay, Opuntia species are a problem, or at least they occur on about 22, 23%. Mesquite was the third most prevalent shrub, invasive shrub, even though it's a native species. Of course, last but not least, Joel Brown, there's Laria tridentata. And then we look at some of the juniper species. Monosperma, Virginiana, and Ashii, which is a Texas species. So hopefully here, we presented at least the power of the NRI and establishing some benchmarks and starting points to evaluate future conditions and future resource concerns. And only experimentation can sort out the underlying factors of plant community change. The NRI is not an experiment, it's an assessment process. And it basically provides some data, but it doesn't really show like what are the causes of certain situations. We have to maybe develop hypotheses based on looking at the resource needs, like noxious and invasive plants are having a tremendous impact on our rangelands. Lack of wildfire, grazing, what effect does overall grazing have? We do record whether grazing is light, medium, or heavy. And so we can develop a picture and a storyline, but experimentally, I wouldn't go any further than that. That's where science and experiments come into play. So that basically completes my presentation. Are you allowing questions, Joel?
Ken, we don't have any in the chat, and I'm not going to open up to questions from the floor because we've got so many participants this morning.
Okay.
And we're right at time. So if you'll stop sharing, I will introduce our next speaker. Thanks, Ken. That was good to get us started. Our next speaker is going to talk about specifically about some of those Great Plains areas and the tall grass prairie. Dr. Duroc Twidwell is with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So Duroc, over to you.
Hey, great. Thanks so much, Joel. Also, really appreciate people taking their time out of a Tuesday morning, especially those of you out further west. I know it's early, so really excited to talk about this new conservation movement that's happening in the Great Plains. This session, we're talking about transformation to global change pressure, things like climate change. So this is going to give a pretty major leading example of some of the ways that that's happening here in the Great Plains, and really borrowing from some other efforts that have happened elsewhere. So I should also thank, there's really a host of groups. I mean, I'm presenting this work, but it's a huge team effort. We partner a lot with some of the work that's come out of University of Montana, and the Rangeland Analysis Platform there with Brady Allred, Dave Noggle, and so forth. So big shout out to them as well this morning. All right, so really when I remember coming up to Nebraska, and I became a professor up here less than 10 years ago, and there was this discussion on, well, how big of an issue is woody encroachment up here? And this was kind of how we framed it. I mean, we just heard, Ken talk about range condition, and really over the last 25 years, the discipline has been obsessed a bit with understanding these alternative states and state transitions and how those play out. And with what we know now, we would expect that the most catastrophic transitions, the most catastrophic regime shifts are those that transcend scale. So that really represents a grand challenge. If you have state transitions that are transcending scale, they tend to affect every citizen, every person that's tied to those kind of ecosystems. So we're not too concerned about a coral reef that has a small algal patch, that can actually increase diversity. We're not so concerned about a single blowout in the sandhills, but we are concerned if we have whole-scale coral reef collapse due to going from a productive to unproductive algal-dominated system. We're concerned about things like the Dust Bowl, and we saw the scaling up of that kind of change. And likewise, we're not really concerned about planting a windbreak, in the middle of our most intact prairies, but we are concerned if those windbreaks result in encroachment and the scaling up of a regime shift on millions of acres of rangelands. And like everything, we're really good at responding to those changes after they occur with data. So we're really good ambulance drivers in terms of natural resources and responding to crisis. But it's been a challenge to try and prevent state transitions, try and prevent these regime shifts as they occur. So we're a little less successful at preventative care. Now, make no doubt about it, when we're talking about woody encroachment in the Great Plains, or we're talking about cheatgrass, out west in the Great Basin, for example, success stories at large scales are exceedingly rare, and that becomes really our challenge. These types of large scale transitions, we've tied it to every aspect of our way of life: food production, water, increased diseases, school funding, wildlife, et cetera. We can go on and on. Like, these kind of things that transcend scale really affect us. And so I really want to focus on that as we go forward, of how do we impact these types of changes when it's not just on a patch, it's not just on a single property. We're talking about, entire regions that are undergoing transformation and collapse. So in response to this, what happened in the last year, and I'll kind of jump to the conclusion at the end, but we've actually seen major transformation as a result of the types of data that are available and responding to these types of biome scale threats. So not too long ago, of course, like the Sage Grouse Initiative was a great example of trying to scale up for conservation action. The Great Plains now has a Great Plains grasslands biome framework for conservation action. So you can find this online. It's on the NRCS's Working Lands for Wildlife website. And this is the first biome scale framework for America's grasslands from the NRCS. This is the NRCS's contribution to things like the Central Grassland Roadmap, which is a tri-national effort for biodiversity conservation in the face of global change pressures. So think about what's happening. The entire system in the Great Plains, right? I mean, we've lost 2.9 billion grassland birds since 1970. That was the science paper. We're seeing groups start to scale up how they're planning and how they're thinking about conservation this century. We're talking about now biomes being at risk and biome conservation. Of course, it's not just that. The Great Plains is really the powerhouse of the beef industry and our most productive rangelands that exist in North America. So you're seeing a major call for action as a result of changes in resource values in this part of the world. Now, it's been pretty exciting to see how these changes have taken place. And so what we're seeing is this kind of rapid collaboration, iteration, and real-time adoption of taking like these types of frameworks, and those frameworks inform the types of technology we need. And I'll show you a couple glimpses of what's coming. But that technology starts to drive implementation. So as that Great Plains Biome Framework came out, groups like Kansas NRCS released Great Plains Grasslands Initiative. Nebraska just released theirs. South Dakota is working on releasing theirs for 2023. Oklahoma just launched one as well. So we're talking about multiple states saying this is how we're going to implement that framework, leveraging modern technology. And of course, we're not just interested in dollars spent and acres treated. Can we measure the outcomes and the benefits to ecosystem services of that type of implementation? As that happens and we get better outcomes, that starts to reinforce changes and revisions in these frameworks. So this iteration that I'm showing you here, this is how we're operationalizing transformation internally as part of this national science team with Working Lands for Wildlife. It's really been exciting to be part of because we've just seen it move much faster across groups and really a lot more real-time engagement adoption. Now, kind of the chase, the data is just really clear on this. There are two major drivers of that are the biome threats in the Great Plains. So now that we have the kind of data we do, it's become clearer, like In the Great Plains, we're talking about land use conversion due to especially agriculture and woody encroachment. And so if you look at that graph on the left, those two are now occurring at the same rate. That's pretty shocking in the Great Plains, given that, you know, if we make a decision to plow up grassland tomorrow, right, it occurs overnight. But woody encroachment tends to be a much slower process that we tend to think of over this slow decadal change. So we're starting to see this move so rapidly. And of course, climate change is known to exacerbate that, that we're actually seeing them occur at the same rate today. So these are your two biome scale threats. Other threats are more local. Also, of course, important, as Ken was talking about in the previous talk. But the two biome threats, of course, are driving change in the Great Plains grasslands. So look at this cultivation risk map that's part of this plow print layer. Everywhere that is white on this map are areas that are already converted. So you see that red checkerboard, that's kind of CRP within 70% areas already converted. In the Great Plains, where you have encroachment, though, is everywhere with low cultivation risk. So the Southern Great Plains, you can see all those areas of low cultivation risk, and they have trees in them. And over time, we've been able to track those and how they're moving now and affecting the central and portions of the Northern Great Plains. So it's not the tractor, it's the trees. That's what we're seeing play out. Now, the Central Grasslands Roadmap used that to develop this, this Great Plains Grasslands risk map. And you can find this on their website, but it produces a combined layer. So that's what happens if you combine them. So you can start to see our core areas. All of a sudden, we have very few that are remaining that are large and intact at a biome level. So the sum of this story is that this is just the state of our biome in the Great Plains. We're talking about 130 million acres at risk of woody encroachment or further agricultural conversion. And we're already hemorrhaging biodiversity and conservation losses tied to these two biome threats. So if we aren't able to adapt and change how we're managing rangelands, right, out of the old model that didn't have these kind of pressures, we're really going to struggle in the Great Plains going forward. And I think that's something really important for everyone to hear. Make no doubt about it, no group of rangeland professionals have had to deal with this scale of conversion and pressure. And are we able to adapt in our profession fast enough, given what continues to take place in this region? Now, all this became really possible, and that's what's, I guess, unfortunate and challenging. We just didn't have the kind of data and technology in rangelands to promote these types of transformation. So now that we have things like the Rangeland Analysis Platform, we can track every major functional group with rangeland vegetation for every pixel, all the way going back from 1984 to present. For me, this was like Pandora's box. We could really start to tell a more complete story, and we could start to compare in the Great Plains. What are our bigger challenges? Is it, you know, annuals? Is it bare ground? Is it trees? And we can start to prioritize accordingly. So great shout out here to friend and colleague Brady Allred for having the foresight to develop it. And this starts helping us connect those kind of theories associated with state transitions and how they're playing out. Now, NRCS responded to this overnight and really contributed 10 million acres from state NRCS leadership to start tackling this issue. We actually showed how to scale up our management and cost effectiveness of woody encroachment. And the other big one, of course, is land use conversion and classical applications of CRP. In both cases, we're talking about efforts that are meant to conserve and anchor to more intact grassland conservation efforts, scale up what we've done in the past, and really try and do a better job of sustaining and managing these really important grassland areas that are left. This is something that, again, you can find this online. I've got some links that I can provide. But there's two sections in this, one associated with land use conversion, one associated with woody encroachment. For time's sake today, and because we're really seeing transformation on woody encroachment, I'm going to talk about it. So this is a kind of what the big change we're seeing. Instead of just restoring areas that have been lost to woody encroachment, we're starting to better understand that approach just is doomed to fail. If you clear like what you're seeing in that photo, there's seed, right? With mechanical remover, those seed left everywhere in that rangeland. So what's going to happen? It's going to grow new trees, which then means you have to cut it again, which means you get the horrible quote from my training in Texas, which is you had to sell the ranch 3 times to pay for brush management. We've now, with partnerships with large scale private lands efforts, it's just been proven that a better approach is when you're able to reduce that risk in the first place. You know, it's kind of invasive species 101, prevent it from occurring in the first place, anchor to your more intact areas, and then start pushing against it. If we're going to manage woody encroachment, we have to disrupt its biological mechanism for spread, which is seed. We only managed and targeted taller, mature trees. And that's really where our guidance was doomed to fail. This was part of the multi-state extension effort in the Great Plains that we helped lead. There was 19,000 copies requested for printing and mailing. As a result of it, we really view this as better management practices, or evolving our best management practices to better deal with woody encroachment. It's meant to reduce risk and vulnerability. For those of you that know this kind of risk and vulnerability frameworks for climate change, it borrows from that same framework. When we're talking about what drives risk, we're talking about sensitivity and exposure. So what did we miss? We missed thinking about exposure. Proximity to seed sources is more important in the data now than what management you use. So the number one predictor is just how close you are to a seed source. That's a big change in understanding from what we had in the past. So check this vulnerability guide out. Really provides a lot better information how we can manage these issues at scale, and start to win the war a little bit on woody encroachment here. Now, to give you some background on this, like look at this kind of data that we can now generate. So when we talk about, right, the scale at which regime shifts are occurring, we were interested in seeing like how big can we see these transitions taking place. So think of the state of our biome. Everywhere you're seeing that's red is dominated by woodies. Everywhere we're dominated by grasses or blue. To give you an example, that red spot in the middle of Nebraska is Halsey National Forest, where we planted cedar trees in the middle of sandhills. So everywhere red looks more like that than our more intact grassland area. Of course, here's your western boundary where the Great Plains ends. Here's that eastern boundary in 2000. Now, we don't care where these boundaries exist, but we do care if they move. So that's 2018. So just in case there's a little bit of lag here, that's 2000. This is 2018. This is biome scale alternative states or biome scale transitions. We're talking about the collapse of the biome in half of my lifetime. Our systems are rapidly changing, and are we keeping pace with this type of change at this regional scale? I mean, North America's grassland is collapsing, and we are chasing this transition into more intact areas. We spent 177 million in the last farm bill on brush management. Where do we spend that money? We spend it in the red, and we spend it on small acres because it costs hundreds of dollars if you wait. What if we spent that money getting ahead of woody encroachment, paralyzing it and pushing back against it? You can see the Flint Hills burns 2 million acres a year. It looks more like a paleo relic, like the Black Hills of South Dakota. This is the only region that's even made this biome collapse flinch. And of course, their managements had to go up because now they're surrounded by a woody biome state. So this is the kind of challenge we have against us, but also where that guidance starts helping us adapt and change and transform going forward. Now, this is, these signals serve as an early warning. Everywhere yellow that you're seeing on these maps become red. It's an early warning for these regime shifts taking place. And of course, one of the classic ones that past postdoc Caleb Roberts had done was tie this to prairie chickens. So for example, as these transitions are taking place, you just have increasingly unusable habitat space. And so what do you want to do? Well, this is simple. If you care about chickens, keep the blue, right? Like you want to avoid these transitions at large scales because that's what's critical for grassland dependent wildlife. So keep the blue because prairie chickens avoid it. And so do multiple other species that we've started to tie this to. Now, if you don't care about chickens, and of course this is rangelands, you know, maybe you care about agricultural production coming out of rangelands. So this is something that Scott Morford out of the University of Montana is leading. we can now track how many tons of production are lost to wood encroachment. This signal you're seeing here provides early warning for losses in rangeland production. So Nebraska, right? Like we lost 419,000 tons in 2019 to woody encroachment. So everybody can start figuring out how many tons that actually is. It's a huge amount. Well, of course, Nebraska used to look like South Dakota. So the warning to South Dakota is that look at where you're going to be going long term. They've lost 145,000 tons now. Well, of course, Kansas used to look like Nebraska. They're now up to 2 million tons. Oklahoma used to look like Kansas. They're up to 4.4 million tons. And that's just what's in our rangelands. So the longer we keep waiting and not securing our best grasslands left, we're just constantly having to manage woody encroachment on every square inch. And if we think that it's not going to happen there, the data keeps showing it's happening in places it's never happened before. So these early warning signals can really help us get out in front of it if we can really help advance transformation in the coming decade. Now, this product will be available later this year, but you can actually see these trends and what's happening for each county. So finally, rangeland production statistics will match the rest of ag communications, right? Like how much corn was grown in Osborne County, Kansas, or how many soybeans. We now have the same data for rangelands. We're finally playing the same game in rangelands that the rest of agriculture does in the Great Plains. We grow a ton of biomass here in the Great Plains. We just haven't communicated it. What did we say in rangelands? Like, well, here's how many pounds per acre, how many grams per meter squared I had. We never really talked about how big this is for statewide agriculture. And so that's something we've now have that we're really excited about because it's really helping to foster change. If you're seeing these dips in rangeland production, check out those early warning signals. Like we want to avoid that from happening in the first place. So if we're seeing those early warning signals, we want to act sooner before we get to the levels that we're observing in Osborne County, Kansas, for example. If we're going to do that, like this is a great graphic and kind of sums up just the change. Instead of really expensive treatments after we have a major crisis or concern, get out in front of it, anchor to intact grasslands, start to arrest that dispersal and recruitment, and then push against it. So there's this kind of mantra that's taken off that's being shared across regions of defend the core, grow the core. This is a great example of that. Don't constantly manage reinvasion, because if you don't manage this yellow, that'll become encroachment and look red in the future. So there's just this key thing that we missed biologically of how we ought to better manage encroachment. The lack of doing that is why we're losing our biome. So this is what really that Great Plains Grassland Initiative, this guidance, that biome framework, it's really trying to operationalize this style of information coupled with that technology to get out in front of our biome scale threats. And maybe that way we can have more success this coming decade. We're starting to see that with both things like CRP and woody encroachment. These are two great examples. And ultimately, I think this is key. Like, we're not going to get too far ahead on these types of threats and issues when we're talking about climate change, biome scale threats associated with invasive species or land use conversion, if it's not directly coupled and tied with private lands. If we're going to really win, align with this mission, you know, these are the groups that are reinforcing that culture and have the best potential to really reinforce this whole effort long term. So none of it's really possible if we're not directly interacting with them. So with that, I'll leave you with one of the last major intact prairies in the Great Plains. This picture of the sandhills. Talk about a grassland that's treeless at large scales. These are pretty rare nowadays of seeing a horizon like that. Thanks for talking about this morning, and really looking forward to other speakers in this session. So thanks, Joel.
Thanks, Duroc. That was pretty impressive. Appreciate it. And as we don't see any questions in the chat, and we're pretty much right on time, let's go to our next speaker, Dr. Brandon Besselmeyer. Brandon is with the ARS Jornada Experimental Range in Las Cruces. Brandon?
All right, thank you, Joel. How's my screen look?
It looks fabulous.
Great, thank you. That was a great talk, Durak. And I'll start off from the prairie and end up in a perspective from the desert grasslands of the Southwest. And I'll also start with sort of the broad observation that our responses to transformation ultimately depend on conceptual or mental models of ecosystem change. And those models are continuing to expand over time. These models determine how we understand the possible futures of an observed ecosystem and the management decisions that we use to preserve or produce a desired future state. So in the early 20th century, that model that we used was the range condition or the succession retrogression model. And there was the assumption of a single equilibrium plant community for a site. There was a predictable rate of return to an equilibrium composition when you could adjust drivers that were under your control, like grazing pressure or fire. The objective was to manage for a steady state, and a key assumption was that there was climate stationarity over management time scales. Climate stationarity really refers to the statistical properties of climate variables that do not change over time. So you can see in this graph on the left, a stationary pattern where the mean is the same and the variability is similar over time, and then a shift across that dashed line to a non-stationary pattern where there may be, with regard to management responses, a coping range, a zone that's a little, or at least sometimes outside of that normal pattern, and then of course an extreme set of conditions that can cause state transitions. So the state and transition model, of course, was an advance in the late 20th century that acknowledged multiple stable community equilibria for a site, that thresholds and feedbacks may require intensive restoration to recover desired states. And you can manage for multiple states if you want, but like the succession retrogression or range condition model, the state and transition model has also assumed climate stationarity in most applications. I refer to this as the circularity of stationarity, in which the models seem to imply a stationary environment in which full restoration is possible if you can overcome those local restoration thresholds. And so you see this pattern of going from a reference state to an intermediate stable state that may degrade to a highly altered state, and then you can get yourself back to the reference state. This type of approach to state and transitions is beginning to be reconsidered through what has been referred to by Steve Jackson in a science paper last year as transformational ecology. And the application of transformation ecology has been referred to as the RAD, resist, accept, direct framework. And this is a really innovative and very productive way of thinking about states and transitions in a non-stationary environment, where you have three options to choose from a particular state. You can either resist this inexorable change that's being caused by climate change or other forces, where you're trying to maintain or restore a current or historical ecosystem state under changing conditions. You can accept the change, go with the flow, and allow that change to happen without intervention, or you can direct the change, where you're intervening to encourage change toward new ecosystems with desirable characteristics. You're letting it change, but you're trying to steer the change to the degree that you can do that. And so what this leads to in thinking about RAD, the RAD framework in a state and transition model context, is a tree-like state and transition model, where you may be coming from a historical state. You're in the yellow current state. And the question is whether once you're in the current state, you resist, you accept, or you direct to different states, and then acknowledge that future state options are going to be contingent on previous decisions as well as natural events like droughts. So under this framework, equilibria are often temporary. Those thresholds and feedbacks locally may constrain the ability to guide trajectories from a particular state. We can apply these RAD decision options, and we acknowledge that climate and non-stationarity is going to influence our management trajectories. So what I'm going to do with that background is talk a little bit about thinking about this framework in desert grasslands of the southwestern United States by reviewing some results from the Jornada experimental range where I work, as well as some studies we have in surrounding grasslands and what the implications are about how we might be managing transitions from perennial grasslands toward shrub and bare ground dominated states, which is our primary problem in this region. So I'll start with a description of the Jornada permanent chart quadrat study, which gives us some perspective on the drivers of change. This is a long-term study based upon 122 quadrats that were established from 1915 to 1927 that have been remeasured annually until 1979. We had very dense data, and then it was discontinued, and then fortunately picked up again by Chris Havstad in 1995, and we've been remeasuring these quadrats every 5 years. Most recently this past year, so we have 106 years of total data on vegetation change across the Jornada. The method that was used was a pantograph that provides very precise measurement of cover and species presence. So what this lacks in extent of measurement, it makes up for in detail. And of course, we have 122 of these quadrats across the Jornada. So one of the things that we wanted to investigate was how grass cover has been changing. And we know it's been highly variable as illustrated in this graph, but really the drivers have been poorly understood. Certainly we see from 1916 to 1979 in blue there, the collapse in the 1950s that has been documented in many studies and that has been attributed to poor grazing management during a drought episode. But we also wanted to ask, could climate variability also be a primary cause of not only the drop in the 1950s, but some of these other variations that we see in this time series. So we tested a number of climate variables: temperature, annual rainfall in winter and summer, standardized precipitation and evaporation index, as well as an ENSO related index. And this one was one that we had never looked at before, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index, which is an index of Pacific sea surface temperature variability that is similar to the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO. And in the Southwest, the warm phase shown in red in that graph below produces more moist conditions, and the cool phase in blue there produces more dry conditions. So this is a multi-decadal scale of variability that's pretty well matched to the multi-decadal record of vegetation that we have from the Jornada quadrats. So we tested a variety of these models, and it turns out that the PDO index alone is the best model. So it's very highly correlated to variations in grass cover from 1916 to 79. And we see here that the 1950s grass collapse can be adequately explained by this climate teleconnection. And so the next question is grass going to recover with a shift to a positive PDO index? And so what we've done here is in this left graph is to predict what we would expect in grass cover on the y-axis there based upon the data from 1916 to 1979, and then compare those with those dots in the lower right, which are the observed grass cover records. So the dots are observed, and that line, that black line with the confidence interval is predicted. And what we're seeing is that our observed records fall far below what the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index would predict based upon its relationship to data from 1916 to 1979. And this period, this shift after 1979 corresponds to increasing temperatures shown in that top right graph, as well as a landscape level increase in shrub dominance that we also see inside of those quadrats. We also see that core species such as Bouteloua areophyta, black grama are a declining share of grasses over time. We see this gradual replacement of the core species in this graph shown in yellow by transients, especially Sporobolus species, as well as Aristid or Threon species since the 1950s. So even though, as you look at this graph, there was a little bit of an increase in the late 60s and the early 70s before the end of our dense record, we see here that black grama and some of these core species in other parts of the landscape were a declining fraction of those species that were able to recover. When recovery does occur on eroded soils, for example, those former dominants like black grama tend to be replaced by other species. That top series is a set of changes that we're studying on sandy soils, where we know from historical records that it went from black grama to sort of bare ground dominated area with mesquite. And then during an extreme rainfall event in 2006 to 2009, we saw grass recovery, but not black grama, other types of species like bush muley, Muhlenbergia porteri. The alternative pathway on the Jornada is to non-native layman lovegrass, and we're seeing that species expand into some of these areas that transitioned previously from black grama to mostly bare ground. So the next question is, can shrub removal catalyze the recovery of grasses? Can we try to recover black grama or any grasses by removing shrubs and perhaps take advantage of favorable rainfall periods? This is something that we've been examining as a part of the Restore New Mexico Collaborative Monitoring Program with the Bureau of Land Management. And this really constitutes in the RAD terminology of an attempt to resist this inexorable change toward shrub domination that we're seeing in the Southwest. We assessed restoration effects across Southwest New Mexico in a number of paired treatments and controls with 5 years of duration in our monitoring records from each of those sites, and looking specifically at the effects of tebuthyron that were used, a chemical that was used to control shrubs, largely creosote bush. What we see in these monitoring data is that total grass cover does in fact increase on treatments while declining on the untreated controls, that ruderal grass species are the primary species that are increasing in the treatments. That's the graph in the lower right, where we see fluff grass, Dasycloa pulchella, really responds quite well to the treatment. If you look in the lower right, our bunch and suffrutescent grasses, the historically dominant species across this range of ecological sites, did not increase, but they did not decline as much, suggesting that the treatments are increasing resilience to drought that has affected most of these plots during this 5-year time period that we've been monitoring them. We also looked at restoration effects along an elevation gradient, which tends to take us from very warm and dry conditions to cooler and more mesic conditions with elevation. And what we see is that the most consistent increases in historically dominant grasses are occurring at higher elevations. So that's the graph on the left, and you can see that positive relationship with grass recovery. So what we're seeing on the y-axis is the increase in foliar cover due to the herbicide treatment. So the treatment essentially minus the control. We see that we can have loss even at low elevation. So at very low elevation, sometimes the treatments actually lose cover for some reason. On the other hand, we see that forb canopy cover tends to increase in those low elevation sites, much more so than it does at higher elevations. So if we take this idea and interpret it in the RAD type framework, we see that shrub control in desert grasslands, which is really one of our primary means to manipulate these transformations directly, certainly aims to resist, and applications to wetter, cooler sites sometimes constitute resistance, that we're able to preserve our perennial grasslands. And sometimes, on the other hand, it can be directing to novel grass communities. We may not be replacing the species that were formerly there, but we're replacing perennial grasses that are able to stabilize soils, provide forage, and provide desirable ecosystem services. Applications of brush management to drier and hotter sites, on the other hand, might constitute directing toward forb communities that are now replacing what were formerly perennial grass dominated sites before the shrubs encroached. And treatments that may be aiming to increase grasses in dry, hot sites might be misdirecting, such that acceptance would have led to a better outcome. And I'll explain what I mean there. And that is that we need to consider the next iteration of state transitions in RAD decisions, not the ones that we made just now, but what the consequences of those decisions are going to be in the long term. For example, we may see that a treatment is initially successful. We go from a shrubland to a community that's dominated by perennial grasses, not necessarily the perennial grasses that were there historically, but perennial grasses nonetheless. But hot droughts of the future might limit the survival of these communities, leading us to ask, would accepting these shrubland states that, while not providing many ecosystem services, may have limited wind erosion and provided for net primary production in these sites, would those shrublands have been a better option if the alternative is eventually going to be bare ground? So I'll conclude with these observations that desert grasslands are undergoing a directional trend toward increasing aridity, and we have to consider management with regard to state transitions in the context of this progressive aridification, that a triage approach to RAD decisions that's linked to state transition models may be a productive way for us to frame management options under rapid change. We have to consider that any near-term decisions that we make may constrain our future decisions or provide for opportunities in the future as well. But we don't really understand that sequence very, very well. And we really need to link monitoring with modeling in order to do that. And then, of course, we're going to have collaborative monitoring as well as collaborative adaptive management to be able to adjust those decisions, considering the variety of value systems that are going to be at play as these systems change in the future. So with that, I will conclude, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Brandon. Well, our first three speakers have really given us a lot to think about. And we're pretty much on time, so I don't see any questions in the chat. I will go on to our next speaker, Dr. Emily Elias. Emily is with the USDA Southwest Climate Hub in Las Cruces. So Emily, you now have the floor.
Joel, I'm just pulling up my presentation. Are you able to see it?
We certainly are. We're looking at your speaker view though.
How's that?
There you go. Got it.
All right, great. Thanks, Joel. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm Emily Elias. I direct the USDA Southwest Climate Hub, and I am also a research hydrologist at the Jornada Experimental Range. And today I'm going to talk about measured data. What are we seeing out there on the landscape? And this really builds on what Brandon just showed. You'll see some similarities. We did not plan this, so that's interesting. I want to acknowledge a lot of contributors. I'm using a weight of evidence approach. So I'm relying on information from Helena Deswood, John Bradford, Katie Steele, conversations with Joel Brown, Sky Aney, Sherry Spiegel, Darren James, and also Andrew Felton. So as I mentioned, my objectives are to look at measured data and see if those measured data indicate climate exposure in New Mexico. And Duroc mentioned this briefly, exposure being kind of changes in the system, external changes in the system. What does observed data indicate about rangeland sensitivity in New Mexico? And I focused on New Mexico because we were all going to be in person in Albuquerque. So I wanted to focus in where our location would be this year. What are other observed changes in New Mexico agroecosystems and communities? And then finally, how do those observations fit in with the resist, accept, and direct paradigm of climate transformation? So you just saw this. We did not plan this, Brandon and I, but clearly we're thinking along the same lines. The question is really, are you shaping the trajectory of change? If you're not, then you're accepting. And Brandon mentioned that maybe that could be a better option than trying to resist or direct. If you're trying to use management for historical conditions or a new desired condition, then you're either resisting, trying to stay within your historical conditions, maybe as thinking about that woody encroachment. If you're trying to push against that, then you're trying to stay in that resist area. Or if you're looking towards something new, then you may be directing the change. So I'm going to talk about exposure in New Mexico briefly. There are 8 different climate zones in New Mexico. What I want to point out here is that this is using climate at a glance data from NOAA for different climate zones or divisions across the state. What you can see here is the mean from 1901 to 2000, this mean line, this black line. And from about 1985 on, for the most part, our average annual temperatures are above that historic mean. So we're definitely seeing an increase in temperature, an increase in that temperature exposure. Precipitation is another story. It's highly variable. You can see the same mean line here, but it's hard to necessarily see a trend. Maybe in this zone, it is looking a little lower. But as I move through the climate zones, the 8 climate zones, you will see an increase in temperature very consistently within that zone, a high variability in the precipitation. The same story in each of these zones. I won't stay with it because I summarize it, but you can see again, this increase in average annual temperature, a lot of variability in precipitation in all of the climate zones of New Mexico. To summarize that, I looked at all of the years from 1985 through 2021. And so that ends up being 37 years. Of those, between 31 and 34 had temperatures above the average mean. So that's this percentage here. There's a lot of variability in the average temperature, with the highest being in the southern deserts, not too surprising, and the lowest being in the northern mountains when we're looking at that long-term average. We don't see the same story when we're looking at precipitation, and this is the number of years below the mean. You see a little bit more hovering around the average, sort of some of the years are above, some of the years are below. So that's the exposure that we're seeing so far, the observed exposure in New Mexico for temperature. This is what we're looking at going forward. And as you can see, the observations, which are this orange line, are following within both the lower emissions and higher emissions scenarios for the future. So where we go highly depends on our emissions as we move forward. But we're certainly expecting higher temperatures as we move forward. Now we're moving into sensitivity. And I wanted to look at the long-term mean annual forage production by county in New Mexico. And one thing I want to point out is that you can have pretty low productivity in the northwestern part of the state and pretty high productivity in the northeastern part of the state. So a lot of variability. A lot of variability over the years as well. Like if you consider 2004, 2006, pretty good years for productivity in terms of pounds per acre. And then some years, as we all know, are really pretty challenging in terms of annual forage production. I'm taking a different look at this here. This is based on the work of Andrew Felton and John Bradford from the Ranching Rangelands and Resilience Project. And what I want to show here is the net primary productivity sensitivity to annual rainfall, and that's grams per millimeter of rainfall. And so we're looking at this area here, San Juan County in the northern part of the state, and also Hidalgo County in the southern part of the state. And I think it's important to point out that even these adjacent pixels, areas right next to each other, can have a lot of variability in terms of their response to rainfall. So you can have one pixel that's doing pretty well in terms of grams of productivity per millimeter of rainfall in this dark red, and then another right adjacent to it with pretty low response. This is the same data, just looking at it a bit differently. So on the horizontal axis, you can see that sensitivity information. So grams per meter squared per millimeter of rainfall. And there's a lot of variability. And then the count is just the number of pixels within the county that has that level of productivity. So in Hidalgo County, basically what you're seeing is there's more rangeland, more land classified as rangeland, but very similar range in terms of NPP sensitivity, regardless of the location within the state. And I think that's really important. Now we're going to transition to irrigation, the use of irrigation water in New Mexico. One thing I want to point out is that there are some areas that rely solely on surface water for irrigation. They have no groundwater availability. Other areas rely solely on groundwater. And then some areas, such as Doña County, have both. And that diversification can be, or that diversity can be very helpful when we're talking about an uncertain future with non-stationarity, climate non-stationarity. So also I want to point out there are some areas of the state that irrigate quite a lot, others that don't very much. So these orange counties, San Juan, Doña and Chavez, use a lot of irrigation. But what's been happening over time? So this is divided by groundwater and surface water, looking at water use just for irrigation from 1990 through 2010. I think it's important to point out this potential transition away from using groundwater and from irrigation in general in some of these counties that rely on the Ogallala aquifer. So you can see in Curry County and Chavez County, there's pretty clear decrease in water use for irrigation in those counties. You can also see those counties that rely more on surface water, a bit of a decline here as well. Doñana is another story. It's sort of interesting. So there's a bit of a decline in the use of surface water, but a bit of an increase in the use of groundwater. So again, there's maybe a bit more adaptive capacity when we're looking at irrigation water use when you have multiple sources. Now I'm going to transition to some NASS economic data, and this ties back into what Duroc presented as well in terms of land use change, a decline in agricultural land use and acres in New Mexico since 1997. Also an increase in certain parts of the state, the eastern part of the state, in feed expense since 1997. So we're seeing this change. Does this represent a transition or a transformation? That remains to be seen, and how it's tied to climate is something that we should and could investigate. There is certainly an increase in agricultural land crop insurance in acres of New Mexico, especially in the northeastern part of the state and the southeastern part of the state. There's an increase, especially in the Northeast, in federal program receipts since 1997. So some of those programs that were mentioned before. And now we're getting a bit into a disaster program. So this is a disaster program from the Farm Service Agency, Livestock Forage Disaster Program. What I wanted to show here is just the variability. This is tied to the drought monitor. So when drought conditions occur within the normal grazing period, which is all year for the most part in the state, you can see payments are related to that, and especially here in Chavez County, up to $6 million in some years related to drought conditions. So a lot of variability in those payments. Now I'm switching to the risk management agencies. So crop insurance indemnity payments are for the pasture, range, and forage program. What I want to show here is that there really weren't many payments at all. Of course, this is tied to the Farm Bill. There weren't many payments until more recently, until around 2010 and beyond. There's been a big increase in payments. But these aren't consistent across the state. These payments are really in the southern counties of the New Mexico of the state, and also the eastern counties of the state. They don't vary a whole lot throughout the year. There's some payments in each month of the year. And the total has been around $114 million for that crop insurance program between 1989 and 2020. So there's certainly an increase in the use of these programs. At the same time, when we're looking from 1970 to present, employment in agriculture in New Mexico has certainly increased, and we've seen that consistently here. And the cash receipts from marketings in New Mexico have, there's a lot of variability here, but you haven't seen a major decline in those, and then maybe a little bit of a decrease in the crops more recently, but that's a much smaller portion of the cash receipts. So to summarize, there's definitely been an observed increase in our mean annual temperature, and I do want to say the extremes, of course, can be more important. So we have the data looking at the means, but looking at the extremes is important going forward. There's a lot of spatial and temporal variability in the NPP, and there's a high sensitivity to rainfall, but there can be very localized regions, and even more local than that, pixels, right? Neighbors with higher production. There's a decrease in agricultural land in all ag districts between 97 and 2017. And does that signal some type of transformation or transition? And how is that linked to climate would be the next questions. There has been an increase in feed expense between 97 and 2017 in eastern New Mexico. And they really only use groundwater for irrigation in that area, and there has been less groundwater used since then. So does that signal some type of transformation? There are trends in surface and groundwater use for irrigation. Some of the major irrigators, major counties, including San Juan and Doñana, are using less surface water for irrigation and relying, at least in Doñana, on groundwater. There's an increased reliance on both disaster programs tied to the drought monitor and enrollment and payments for some forage-related crop insurance programs. Those really started in the last 10 to 12 years. And there's an increased enrollment in federal programs in the Northeastern Agricultural District of New Mexico. So what does this mean? Circling back. So we're showing here what Brandon had showed before in terms of RAD, resistance, acceptance, or directing the changes. And then, of course, as any paradigm, there are more complicated recent paradigms in terms of thinking about active resistance or passive resistance, what resilience might look like, and then accelerated, all the way to accelerated transformation. And so I leave you with questions, things to consider. Where are we on this resistance to transformation scale in the different systems that support rangelands and rangeland communities? What's needed for appropriate community-led and respectful agroecosystem response to those exposures, to the changes in exposure that could be temperature, precipitation, even carbon dioxide, and also in light of the sensitivity of these systems? And then when does a trend become either a climate response or a transformation, and how can we incorporate attribution into that? So with that, I'll turn it back to Joel. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. Very nicely done. I don't see any questions in the chat. We are just a tad ahead of schedule. So Emily, I have a question for you. You showed that graph of employment in New Mexico agriculture. Everything you showed was kind of believable to me. That one was a shock. Do you have any idea what is driving the increase in employment in agriculture in New Mexico?
Joel, that is a great question. And I was also surprised by the graph. It's from a company called Headwaters Economics that relies heavily on NAS data, actually, for this. And it's, again, indexed to the 1970 numbers. So we're looking at basically a 40% increase since 1970 in employment in agriculture in New Mexico. But the source of that, what's driving that's a good question. And I have to take a deeper dive into the data.
And I think, I mean, if that is what we think it is, and it, we can support that, I think we've got a pretty good basis to make an assertion that, more than ever before, if we are going to address climate change, it's going to have an impact on people's livelihoods.
Absolutely. And it was, it's a bit concerning because we're thinking about this era of non-stationarity and looking at things like pecan production and chili production in New Mexico, along with our rangeland production, and coming up with adaptive measures to support that industry in when our water levels are declining and temperatures are increasing. It's a big challenge. It's a big challenge for all of us.
Okay, no other questions. Thank you, Emily. And thank all the other speakers, Ken Spaeth, Duroc Twidwell, Brandon Besselmeyer, as well as Emily. Thank you so much for keeping us on time. And we are, because of your diligence, we are at the point where we can take a 10-minute break now and allow people to refresh. So let's be back in exactly 10 minutes and we will begin again. Our next speaker will be Dr. Haley Wilmer. All right, 10-minute break. Thanks. All right, everyone, thank you and welcome back. I don't know about the rest of you, but that 10-minute break allowed me to get in a couple of miles of run and do some exercises. So that really refreshed me. And we will move ahead. Our next speaker this morning is Dr. Haley Wilmer. Haley is with the ARS Sheep Research Station in Du Bois. So Haley, you're up.
Good morning. Can you see my screen?
Yes. You should put it in presentation mode, I think.
Oh, okay. Let me do that real quick.
There you go.
Now you can see the presentation mode.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Let me know if that changes. We're a little windy this morning too, so I apologize for the background noise. I'm excited to be here to present some papers that haven't been sent off yet. But we have results and we had a fun time kind of synthesizing this information. I was lucky enough to be part of a NIFA project called the Ranching, Rangelands, and Resilience, which was a large multi and interdisciplinary project looking at, and I think Emily mentioned it, some of the ecological and social dynamics around the West related to resilience. And this idea of resilience that Joel's kind of brought forward here with this symposium has been a quandary for many of us because it's been used as a buzzword to the point where it's almost lost its meaning. And I thought that was a real shame because it's potentially a place where we could sort of find some common ground or start thinking about social and ecological dimensions together. And so I'm going to talk about resilience as a buzzword. And I just want to make sure you all have a chance to look at this long list of great co-authors who stuck with me through this kind of crazy thought experiment that I'm presenting today. So the premise of this presentation is that resilience is creating interdisciplinary collaborations and so I've got results from two studies, one from an ecological lens and one from a social science lens that looks at resilience. And I think there are individual contributions of those lenses, but also synthetic insights for range science and management in particular, which is kind of this in-between field that's concerned with praxis and management, to help us see where there's some mismatches in the two different approaches and how we're thinking about resilience, particularly as they come to the scale, temporal and spatial, and also the agency. When we say agency in social science, we mean people's ability to do something about it. And then I'm going to argue at the end of this presentation, if Joel doesn't cut me off, I'm going to argue that we could engage with this idea from Donna Haraway, she's a philosopher, of staying with the trouble. And I'm going to argue that if we continue to commit to dialogue and collaboration among these different lenses of resilience, or these different theoretical lenses, we'll start to see the beyond pasture needs for strategies and action, and we'll start to get somewhere in our collaborations. And the subtext for this is, as a postdoc on this project, I saw folks just flying by each other disciplinarily. And I'm always kind of caught in the middle. I don't know, maybe it was because I was a kid and when my parents got divorced, I was always trying to get them to see each other's point of view or something. And I grew up to do that in my professional work. And so here I'm trying to sort of reconcile these different lenses to bring the social, the range science, and the ecology kind of together. Not a transdisciplinary integration, but maybe a little bit more interdisciplinary. So I'll start out with the first study. So walk with me through the ecological lens of resilience, and we'll think about it a little bit more carefully. Andrew Felton, Bob Shriver, Peter Adler, and the sensitivity team at Utah State led this project, and they used historical satellite-based data of forage production and weather to build ecoregion specific statistical models of forage sensitivity to temperature and precipitation variability. And they fed projections from 11 different climate models through those statistical models to project mid-century changes to forage across the Western US rangeland sectors. And they focused on growing season weather. And there's some limitations to this. Of course, the models are based on historical relationships. So we're not modeling future CO2 or warming. And it's potentially more pessimistic because it does not include those other factors. And these on the right here, this figure is the are those ecoregions, the hot deserts, cold deserts, California annual grasslands, northern mixed prairies, and short grass steppes. And those ecoregions also relate to our social data that I'm going to present on later. The projections are for mid-century percent change in average production under high emission scenarios. The projections of mid-century change in the probability of years of low forage production, which are defined as 75%, less than 75% of the historical mean. And the maps are aggregated at the county level of these projections. So here's the big picture. This figure on the left is average change in forage production, and on the right, it's average change in probability of a bad year, aggregated at the county level. The southern plains and the hot deserts under these projections are particularly vulnerable to change in the probability of a bad year. I'm actually feeling quite pleased about sitting in Du Bois, Idaho at the moment, taking a look at these maps. So this dark red is up to 256% increased change in probability of a bad year across the Western US. But take a look at the hot deserts here, and then also the short grass steppe. And those are some pretty alarming rates of probability of a bad year. The northern mixed prairies are there as well. So they predicted smaller changes in forage production by mid-century for northern Great Basin and California annual rangelands relative to those other ecoregions, and larger changes in the southwestern US. So the southwestern and southern plains appear to be the most vulnerable, and they recommend that those are the places in the country where there's the most urgent need for adaptation. Okay, the second lens that I would like to present is the social science lens. So while we were working on those projections, another team went out and did a series of focus groups in the same ecoregions: Western Nebraska, Northeast Colorado, Northern and Southern Utah, Gila County, Arizona, Southern California, and Humboldt County, Nevada. And they convened focus groups with public lands managers, except in Nebraska, where they weren't available on the west side of the state, as well as with 8 to 10 ranchers. And we sought out folks who'd been ranching for 20 years. And these focus groups emphasized learning about what ranchers were dealing with in terms of stressors and challenges, what opportunities they saw to deal with those stressors and challenges. We also had them walk us through a production calendar, tell us what a good year is like here, tell us what a bad year is like here. And we coded those focus groups to better understand how ranchers see resilience. What's their point of view of what's working, what's not working? How are they dealing with these stressors? I presented this last night to the Clark County, Idaho Stock Growers Association, and I think it resonated with them as well. We've got a story map coming out on the social side of the project. It's not out yet, but essentially this figure kind of summarizes what the ranchers across those different regions told us. And essentially the height of the bar here is sort of represents more agency or more ability for ranchers to act about 4 different types of change. So essentially we have 4 different interconnected social ecological ways of thinking about resilience. And so ranchers really told us they had a lot of tools in the toolbox and a lot of understanding around dealing with changing ecological conditions, but they had less and less ability to deal with changing economic conditions, changing ranching communities, and changing rangeland uses, including seeing more recreationists, more development, more transition out of ranching uses. And so here we list some of the tools that people are using. And this is pretty straightforward. Ranchers are ranchers. They're really good at ranching. They're not necessarily politicians and lawyers, or the folks that we talk to didn't necessarily have tools to deal with some of these other challenges. And so we categorize some of the threats, the scales of adaptation that people are working at, and some of the examples of the ways that they were adapting. And really found that at an individual ranch scale, folks had a lot of tools in the toolbox, a lot of forms of resilience across the system. But at the system-wide scale, even community and larger scales, whether that's temporal or spatial, they oftentimes didn't have much to draw from in terms of solutions. So we always like to put in our qualitative quotes. I'll just read quickly the one at the bottom. This rancher in northern Utah said, "I played with everything to try to get my cattle to where I think will work, and it's a challenge. Is the juice worth the squeeze? All the effort you go into it, do you see a return?" So that speaks to the economic challenges that producers are facing, the low profit margins, they're producing high quality beef, but they're just not seeing the return. So there was a lot of discussion about whether ranchers actually have any agency to do what they want to do. Do they make decisions? Do they have decision-making capability? And where does that come from? And that mismatch between the scale of the problem and the agency that folks have on the ground. So to summarize, we talked about 2 studies, and I tried to break these studies down into thinking about the temporal scales, the spatial scales, the metrics, and the implications that the 2 lenses bring to the table. We had ranchers with 20+ years of retrospective perspective, and that's a really different scale than the 30-year mid-century predictive power of the climate science. Those 2 things really miss.
Okay, Haley, if you can hear me, maybe turn your camera off and increase your local bandwidth. And we'll see if we can get you hooked back in.
Hello.
Okay, Haley, turn your camera off. As much as we enjoy seeing you, that may help us.
Okay, there we
Thank
go.
you.
Is that better?
Yes.
All right, let me share again. We'll still have a really loud heating thing about that. Can you see that, Joel?
Yes, there you go, right there.
Okay. So I'm going to argue that these 2 lenses of resilience give us 3 things to think about. The first is that when we work in rangeland science, it's necessary that we talk about applied knowledge and praxis. So even if we're working at kind of these grand social and ecological scales that talk about big picture threats and big picture challenges, there needs to be an applied piece there that folks can take and use on the ground. And that's what the rangeland ecology brings to the table. The second insight is that social and ecological relationships, and I distinguish those 2, operate at larger structural or temporal scales than is often acknowledged in range management research. So this is analogous to the weather versus climate issue in climate science, but it's also as simple as this idea that sociologists have been using since the 80s, which is leaving the farm gate. That the problems and therefore some of the workable solutions are coming from a larger scale. And Nathan talked about this a bit in his plenary. And the third is that understanding these broader scales of interaction and operationalizing resilience as a true boundary object requires us to do this thing called staying with the trouble, or sticking with it and having these conversations together. So we showed the climate projections to the range folks and to the social scientists. They pushed back and said, ranchers are worried at more of the weather scale. They're dealing with today's challenges. They're dealing with what I call the bear in the water trough. There are things that come up that you've got to do to keep your ranch operating. And how am I supposed to think about mid-century projections? But there's an opportunity there when we extend the time scale of how we're talking from a retrospective look to a forward-looking look at mid-century, which is really not that far ahead. When I worked in Southeast Alaska, folks talked about sustainability goals extending to 8 generations in the future. So mid-century is not, you know, an unheard of scale for resilience or sustainability goals. And so it brings into light an imagination about what we're managing for, and to think at eco-regional scales as well. And then it challenges us to start thinking about what levers can we pull now and where to adapt to these changes we see as coming. At the same time, the social approach is really hard to operationalize. Not only do we get criticized for using a lot of jargon, or reframing everything as just political ecological and bringing class and everything, it's hard to know how to use that info. Okay, so ranchers don't have a lot of capacity to deal with big social problems. Well, none of us feel like we do. What do we do about that? I think some ways to think about it are that we can think beyond farm gate. The ranchers are pushing us to see beyond the scale of an individual ranch decision maker, which is actually a pretty patriarchal way of thinking about how range decision making works, and it's inaccurate. So we can see the value of social ecological knowledge. We've been really obsessed with like rancher local knowledge of plant herbivore interactions, which is only so interesting. They know a lot about political economy too. They know a lot about what's happening, what consumers want, what's happening at larger scales with the economy. So we're thinking about community or land use interventions that enable climate adaptation at a larger scale. And again, asking what levers do we have and what can we pull from? So relationship structural scales are kind of hard to reconcile in these two perspectives. And the way that I think about it is if you take these projections that you often see in the climate science about human or anthropogenic driven climate change, and you think about what the ranchers are telling us about resilience, the same processes that are driving these challenges to resilience are driving these changes in our climate. And so we have an obligation to theorize and to converse and to bring down to the ground solutions for these interconnected social and ecological processes. Staying with the trouble is Donna Haraway's framework for multi-species kin making that reimagines a generative approach of human-nature relations. She says she's a post-humanist. She develops this idea in a volume of the same title focused on a feminist philosophy of collective subjectivity. She basically argues that we're not individuals, and she likens this mixing to compost. So staying with the trouble is this idea I think we can use in climate science and range ecology to acknowledge our collective ecological interdependence and the responsibilities, or what Haraway calls responsibilities, relationships, and commitment to dialogue necessary to address resilient human nature thriving. What am I talking about? I'm bringing in this philosophy. Well, when we consider together that these studies leave us with troubling questions, or those questions that push us towards a sort of interdisciplinary dialogue about relationships that really address rangeland resilience and beyond, we might start asking, how do we reconcile social knowledge that's relevant to managers with long-term predictions of change? If ranchers are saying, we don't need to know what's going to happen with forage in 50 years because I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow, or I have no idea who's going to be here in 50 years. We should pay attention to that. How can we think and act for longer term resilience in that context? How will ranch and community level decision-making scales respond to global and climate change? How can researchers and practitioners mobilize beyond ranch level strategies? We've been talking a lot about collaboration. Are there bigger pieces to the puzzle there? What are our metrics? How would we inclusively value each lens and interactions among different systems and scales? How would we actually meaningfully do that in our research and in our practice? And what's limiting the analysis and meaningful action? I would argue that it's literacy in one another's fields and respect for one another's fields. Is if as soon as we get turned off by a word or a theory or an approach to dialogue, we turn down, we shut down. We're not going to have this with this interaction. We're not going to learn. And then we've got to think about the implications for whom. Who will deal with the consequences of the change? Who's supposed to act as a result of our information? Who has the capacity and agency to address change at multiple scales? Is it just the rancher? So Haraway says, the details matter. Each time a story helps me remember what I thought I knew or introduces me to new knowledge, a muscle critical for caring about flourishing get some aerobic exercise. Such exercise enhances collective thinking and movement in complexity. Each time I trace a tangle and add a few threads that at first seemed whimsical, but turned out to be central to the fabric, I get a bit straighter. That staying with the trouble of complex worlding is the name of the game. Love, living, and dying well together on Terra Terrapolis. We're all responsible to and for shaping conditions for multi-species flourishing in the face of terrible histories, and sometimes joyful histories too. But we are not all responsible in the same ways. The differences matter in ecologies, economies, species, and lives. So I think rangelands necessitate an inclusion of multiple areas of knowledge and practice and give us an opportunity to construct new imaginaries or to reimagine the future for systems facing these multifaceted change, but only if we stay with it.
Thank you, Haley. I don't know if that made me feel better or not. I think it did. And I appreciate your presentation. And I don't see any comments or questions in the chat. So Haley, if you would stop sharing, please. I will introduce our next speaker as we're right on time. Our next speaker is Dr. Leslie Roach with the University of California, Davis.
Hi, Joel. Thanks. Haley, I think I need you to stop sharing.
I think I stopped her.
There we go. Okay, let me get on here. Let's see. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yes, ma'am, we got it.
Thank you. Well, I'm just going to pop on to say hello to everyone, and then I'm going to stop my video in case I have similar bandwidth issues. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the California context, building climate resilience across California's working rangelands. And just a shout out to my co-authors, Grace Woodmansey, Dan Macon, Tracy Shore, and Kate Munden Dixon. They've been working with me as well as many collaborators over the last 10 years, kind of on this work that I'm going to present today. And we're coming at this from the perspective of, we're all within UC Cooperative Extension within California, working with stakeholders. So I guess that's our lens. So give a little bit of the California context. California is the largest and most diverse agricultural economy in the nation, with revenue from farms and ranches exceeding $50 billion from over, I believe, 400 different commodities now. Our landscape also includes 34 million acres of rangelands that support diverse ecological and socioeconomic resources. These lands include some of the world's major biodiversity hotspots. They encompass watersheds for nearly all the state's surface waters and support a $3 billion plus livestock ranching industry. So given the scale of production in the state, sustainable agriculture is vital to the economic and environmental security of not just the state, but also the nation. And of course, as we all know, and as we've been talking today already, there are current and future climate risks that are posing many challenges to this. So we have increased frequency and intensity of extreme events such as extreme heat, drought, flood, wildfire, pests and disease pressures, and they're already significantly impacting agriculture and the broader economy. And these conditions, unfortunately, are only providing a glimpse of the future. Within California, our farmers and ranchers are under constant pressure to adjust to these uncertain weather and climate events. And these challenges, as we all know, they are multidimensional and they are wicked problems. Climate change and weather extremes specifically threaten California's rangelands, which are largely rainfall dependent and therefore greatly vulnerable to extreme hazards like drought. The impact of drought on the rangeland economy is the most devastating climate-linked event for our ranching communities. And drought, within California has really played a formative role in the state's early history and has continued to impact the state with 6, I think maybe even more now, multi-year droughts just since 1960. Here you can see this was our historic drought from 2012 through 2016 that we just experienced. So coping with and adapting to drought is critical to the sustainability of these operations. And so coordinated efforts are really needed to develop novel tools and novel strategies to support transformational changes, or to support climate smart agriculture, if you will. And this really needs to be done directly in collaboration with stakeholders on the ground. And with most of these stakeholders being multi-generational, I've done a lot of work over the years. Most of these folks, 3/4 or more are 3rd generation or more. There's a lot of knowledge here to work with, as Haley actually just talked about. And so the framework that I'm kind of operating with is yet another RAD framework. It's the Rangeland Adaptive Decision-Making Framework. With a really showing that land managers are they're making decisions and they're adjusting strategies for multiple outcomes across scales within the context of social ecological system within which their operation is embedded, and really emphasizes how the sustainability of ranching operations depends on their abilities to respond over time to the changing social ecological systems. And so this is what we've been looking at, and I'm thinking about how the interlinkages between the social and ecological systems. So based on this framework, I'll draw on over 10 years of survey and interview data that we've been collecting in collaboration with the ranching community and the rangeland management community to highlight lessons learned, around responding to transformational changes that have threatened ecosystems and livelihoods. And of course, with a special focus on drought, because that has been a major driver for us in California, and as well as many other rangelands, of course. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of the baseline work that we did with cattle producers and the rancher decision making survey way back in 2011. And then some follow-up interviews that we did with both beef and sheep producers during the heart of our 2012 through 2016 historic drought. And then I'll wrap up with some of the interviews that we did with a new generation of ranchers here in California. So back in 2011, we worked with California Cattlemen's Association to survey over 500 California beef producers to kind of get a general picture of factors affecting rancher decision making in terms of getting better understanding of resource networks, operator values, management capacity, et cetera. And we had a specific focus in there on rangeland drought, and really kind of couching the conversation of climate change within that. And so the objectives specifically with regard to coping with rangeland drought were to look at the types of drought strategies that were in place across California's rangelands, and to examine how individual drought adaptation is enhanced by specific decision-making factors. And so I give you a little bit of a kind of, what we saw as baseline. So, in terms of, what are the typical management responses to weather changes? What are those incremental adaptations that folks, were already making? And so we asked about what we termed proactive practices, or practices that were put in place to prepare for a potential drought. And the most utilized practices here, they all revolved, the primary tools revolved around conserving forage and actively managing risk. So doing things like employing conservative stocking rates or incorporating pasture rest into the system. We also asked about those, classical reactive practices. What are things that folks do to respond to a current drought? And, among the most utilized practices here in bold, the primary tools revolved around managing impact to their bottom line. So immediately reducing herd size, purchasing feed to maintain that core herd. Also doing things like looking into or accessing government assistance programs. So those were, the commonly used kind of same base practices across all operators. And we had about, I think there were 7 different proactive and reactive practices that were, kind of most popular or most utilized. And so kind of the next natural question was, well, is everybody just kind of doing, everything the same? They're adopting the same strategies in the same ways, or, how are people putting practices together to form an overall strategy? Is there variability across operations? And so based on individual responses to those practice questions, we statistically identified classes of drought strategies in place across California's rangelands. And what we found was that there were 4 types of on-ranch drought strategies, kind of these really broad classes that spanned a gradient of increasing management intensity. And by intensity, I mean basically spanned a gradient of the number and types of drought practices that were, adopted by each of these classes. And to give you kind of a picture of that, as we move from, left to right across the board, you can see we see an increasing number of, practices that are adopted by each class, ranging from these, dark blue, very reactive practices, drought practices, increasing numbers as we move across, to a greater integration of both reactive and proactive, which is underlined here in gray, practices as we get to the right-hand side of the board here. And so, to summarize, low adoption rates on the left side of mainly reactive practices to, higher adoption rates of both reactive and proactive practices here on the right side. We also looked at background operation variables that might be driving strategy selection. And, not surprisingly, just comparing the left and right hand sides of the board, class 1 here was, had very low adoption rates of these drought management practices. Basically, the only thing they all had in common was they were just purchasing feed to kind of keep the herd going. These tended to be smaller operations with not a lot of resources. In contrast, classes like, classes 3 and 4, which had a larger number of practices and increasing emphasis on proactive practices, these tended to be larger operations with access to more resources. For example, they had different land types within their operation and gave them more flexibility within their decision making. So when we're thinking about what I'm terming transformative adaptation at the ranch level, this can look very different for each of these types of operations. So that's looking at, the sort of the basic structuring variables and what are the types of drought strategies that kind of constrain the universe of opportunities for folks across the state. We wanted to dig into that, that RAD framework and really look at how can we enhance drought adaptation capacity at the individual level and really understand the factors that are potentially driving individual adaptive capacity or drought adaptation in this case. And we defined drought adaptation as, the number, we had multiple indicators here, number of drought practices used, which was really important in structuring those types of strategies that I just showed, as well as having an active drought management plan in place. And so what we found was when we looked at the linkages between these different indicators, basically the take home is we found that increasing information sharing, flexibility of resources, having that large toolbox of practices at their disposal, and then also resource valuation or goal setting. So, thinking about valuing those future forage resources or supporting goals like soil health, like plant community and weed resistance. These all had positive influences and were important in building adaptive capacity. So that's all what we learned kind of in that baseline work that we did with about 500 ranchers across California back in 2011. Following the historic statewide drought that gripped California between 2012 and 2016, we went back out and we worked with both beef and sheep producers to better understand how they were coping with such extreme conditions. And through working with these knowledge networks, we've been learning a lot about drivers of impact, social and ecological vulnerability, and adaptive capacity. And at the time, we were calling this California's historic drought. A lot of folks that we talked to called it the drought of their generation. And so when we're working with these folks, there were 48 beef and sheep producers in this particular study. And we asked a lot of similar questions that we asked in that early 2011 male survey. And then also, dug in quite a bit more as well. And so first, we asked about those baseline practices, those proactive and reactive drought practices. And in terms of proactive practices, this just shows the top 3 practices by operation type. We broke these into sectors of cow-calf operations, sheep operations, and multi-species grazing operations. And we found that, for each of these types, the most utilized proactive practices really revolved around, again, conserving forage and maintaining flexibility. Interestingly, we did observe an increase in proactive practice use across the board when we compared the 2011 and 2016 surveys. Not just increase of overall adoption rates for each of these practices, but we also saw, and I'm not showing it here, but we saw a broader range of proactive practices that folks were using within their operation. So a greater number of total proactive practices that folks had integrated within their operation, which might indicate, those underlying drought conditions that led into this 2012, into this historic drought, that they were a catalyst, for that proactive drought planning. Of course, then we also asked about those reactive drought practices. What are folks doing in response to the current drought, or to this historic drought? And again, the top 3 most utilized practices by operation type, all again largely revolved around balancing forage supply and demand, and managing impact to that bottom line. Now, one of the things that really popped out for us when we were talking about these different drought management practices, both proactive and reactive, is that what came up was multi-species grazing for proactive drought management. Now, we found that multi-species grazing, it actually was the least used proactive drought management practice among folks that we interviewed. So only about 17%, very small group, were integrated proactive multi-species grazing as a drought management practice. But these folks, it was the highest ranked proactive practice based, on reported effectiveness. So these folks, it was a small group, but they really ranked it highly in terms of effectiveness for drought management. So this was really interesting. When we dug into the data, we found that these multi-species grazers, they had greater rates of adoption for several other drought management practices as well. So they had a significantly larger drought toolbox than their single species grazing counterparts. And as we found earlier, that was one of the key factors in enhancing adaptation capacity, was having that flexibility, having more tools available. So this suggests that there's potentially greater flexibility among the multi-species grazers than the single species grazers to cope with these big extreme events like drought. And it makes sense, thinking about diversifying the portfolio. And so these modern day non-conventional strategies that prioritize management flexibility, such as multi-species grazing, may offer potential transformational or climate smart opportunities. And this is something that is kind of a thread that started here, and we're really interested in looking into more. We also asked about folks' perspectives on climate change and their interest in it. And so, we're seeing how planning horizons and perspectives may have been influenced by such a historic event. And so we posed several specific statements on climate change, which we borrowed from colleagues in Australia who worked with ranchers following their millennium drought. And when we posed these statements, we found that in general, these beef and sheep producers in California, they tended to disagree, so be kind of on this orange side here of the chart, with strong negative statements about the impact or importance of climate change. So they disagreed with statements like, generally, about, climate change is not an important consideration when developing options for my ranching business relative to other current issues. So they did see it as important, and they did believe that the future climate would be different than their past experience. We also found that they tended to agree with positive statements about their abilities to adapt and their interest in learning. This is key since we know the climate, environmental, and socioeconomic changes will, without a doubt, create conditions that really exceed any of our past or present experiences on rangelands. And it's important to see how these folks see the landscape, as Haley touched on already. This helps us understand, kind of interacting factors that might fuel transformational adaptation, for example, as opposed to maybe just incremental adaptation. And thinking about, how rangeland, and we're also been thinking about how rangeland social ecological systems are changing in these big ways that we've been talking about all morning. I also wanted to bring up how the people who are stewarding these lands might be changing or might be expanding, and how we might be able to support that. In California, we have a whole new breed of ranchers, which we term first-generation ranchers. And until now, there's been very limited research with this group. At best, they've been generalized as beginning farmers under mini policy and support programs. And so we've been expanding our focus to look at this new group. And so using those baseline 2011 male surveys with the California Cattlemen's Association, we're actually able to compare first generation and multi-generational ranchers looking across these important factors that we found drove individual adaptation capacity. And just kind of in a nutshell, we found that the first generational ranchers, they typically had more limited networks, less access to resources, and fewer adaptation strategies available to them than their multi-generational counterparts. And this potentially makes them more vulnerable to climate and environmental changes. And this group, this was all from that big California Cattlemen's male survey. So these folks were all members of industry association. They generally had similar goals and demographics. And so kind of our next step or hypothesis was that, well, non-member first-generation ranchers, they're likely to have even stronger differences in social networks and on-ranch management practices and drought adaptation strategies because they have, because they're potentially also different in terms of goals and demographics. And so work that was led by former graduate student Kate Munden Dixon. She went out and interviewed what we called, early career first-generation ranchers. And she talked with 40 folks. And what we found was that they were indeed a more diverse demographic. They were generally younger, kind of, more millennial generation, more often women, and more racially diverse than those multi-generational counterparts. They tended to have sheep and goat operations, so, operating more on leased lands. So as you can imagine, creative land access is really key for them. We're also finding they're experimenting with different ways of doing things, but they're starting from scratch. So with this uncertain future, increased outreach and partnerships from support organizations really could be critical to helping this next generation succeed. And so, the really importance of this is when we're thinking about policy and planning efforts, really need to take into account the diversity of strategies developed and, to think about how we can reduce vulnerability across all types of operations and really be inclusive in thinking about that. So kind of relate all this to what are the current events now. Here in California, they're saying we're on the precipice of drought intensification. And, much like the rest of the Southwest, we're stuck in a mega drought, which I just heard has actually been the driest in the last 1,200 years. And so, and folks on the ground, they see this, they've already been living it and they recognize it. As one of our interviewees stated, we expect drought every year now. I'm not sure I'd really call it a drought plan. It's just our normal way of ranching now. And, as we all know, climate related resource impacts will increasingly challenge ranching operations, as we continue to see these extremes increase. And so advancing transformational adaptation, has required a number of things. We're going to need, collaborative science and management partnerships, including local, state, and national policy and program support for proactive management solutions. And we need to think, like Haley said, we need to think more broadly about working across these boundaries, thinking beyond the ranch gate and building cross-institutional partnerships to increase, capacity of not just land managers, natural resource professionals, but us as scientists and our students. And so just to wrap up real quick, as a next steps for this, what we're doing in California is we have very recently launched a collaborative cooperative extension and USDA Climate Hub project with the overarching goal of developing kind of these multifaceted pathways to climate smart ag research and extension. And we're doing this through stakeholder needs assessments that will iteratively inform climate smart ag trainings for technical service providers, regional workshops for farmers and ranchers, and student education with extension service learning opportunities. And this is where we're really bringing in that expert knowledge and on the ground experience to the classroom for that really important workforce development. And how are we going to make this all work? Well, it's those really large multi-partner efforts, farmers and ranchers, commodity boards, NGOs, state and federal agencies, farm bureaus, and ag industry. And these partnerships can, I think, really get us beyond, that ranch gate and work toward transformational adaptation by addressing those very challenging, staying with the trouble, cross-scale sociological, political, and economic drivers. And that's that's what I have. Thank you, everyone. If anyone's interested, please contact me or watch these spaces for more information.
Okay, thank you very much, Leslie. Very interesting. And I don't see anything in the chat, and we're right on time. Thanks, Leslie. I will turn it over to our last speaker. Dr. Anna Maher is with the USDA Northwest Climate Hub in Portland. Anna?
Hello, sorry, I'm just getting things going. Good morning, everyone. About to share my screen. Thank you, Joel. How's it looking, Joel?
That's very good. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Great. Ecosystem services from rangelands and pastures in the Northwest have an estimated annual value of more than $1.2 billion US. I'm going to stop my video and let me know if anything changes. All right. These services include sage grouse habitat, water filtration, and carbon sequestration. Rangelands also help to support the agricultural industry in the Northwest. For example, approximately 29,000 beef cattle ranches and farms generate $1.7 billion US in gross revenue annually. A majority of this is from cattle and calf sales. Today, I'll be presenting portions of a literature synthesis of climate change impacts on rangelands and rangeland management. My position is supported by the Northwest Climate Hub. The Northwest Climate Hub serves Alaska as well, but for this synthesis, I'm focusing on Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, which are the 3 US states in the bottom left-hand corner of the map. Rangelands are indicated in yellow in this diagram. They are a prevalent land type in the Western United States. On the left, we can see the Northwest area is a mix of forest, shown in green, and also rangeland, shown in yellow. Much of these rangelands are shrublands such as sagebrush steppe. Rangeland resources are a critical component of the Northwest economy and also support rangeland livelihoods and communities, cultural values, and traditions. In addition, many wildlife species, including the iconic greater sage grouse, depend upon vast, relatively unfragmented expanses of rangeland for their survival. Rangelands are also an important grazing resource in this region to produce livestock. Cattle production specifically utilizes an estimated total of 47 million acres in the Northwest. And approximately 77% of these acres are publicly owned. Understanding climate change related impacts can help us better prepare these important rangelands for the future. Recent droughts and wildfires provide insight into the types of climate impacts that we are expected to see as well as what we need to do to prepare. Current science indicates that the 2015 drought in the Northwest was indicative of future climate conditions. Impacts from this snow drought included reduced irrigation water, increased heat stress impacts on livestock and also forage impacts, increased fish mortality due to low flows in streams and rivers, and finally, drought-related wildfires burned more than 1 million acres in the Northwest, with impacted areas including sage-grouse habitat and numerous grazing allotments. Just this last year, conditions in spring 2021 contributed to the dry conditions later in the year. This map from the US Drought Monitor shows what current conditions were in August. The 2021 drought was the second driest March to August in a 127-year record. Portions of the Northwest also experienced the hottest June and July on record. With future climate change, it is projected that the Northwest will experience longer, dry periods during the summer, indicating that we can learn some from these impacts that occurred. Some of the drought impacts that occurred in 2021 include, towards the end of the summer, 50% or more of pasture and rangelands in the Northwest were considered in poor to very poor condition. Early sell-off of cattle occurred. Also, widespread fish mortality occurred, and more than 1 million acres burned in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. We think of these as drought-related wildfires because drought causes vegetation to dry out and become more flammable, leading to wildland fires. Indeed, area burned is expected to increase with temperature increases from climate change. For example, this is an estimate of the increase in area burned with a 1 degree increase in temperature. In the center of the screen, areas in yellow indicate a doubling or tripling of burn area. And we can note that the forested areas surrounding that yellow area show much greater increases in projected area burned with increasing temperature. Decreasing snowpack is an important climate change concern in the Northwest, especially during the summer months. In this diagram, the red circles show declines in snowpack. And we can see they're already occurring in many areas of the Northwest. This may exacerbate water and vegetation concerns during drought. Periods of prolonged drought interspersed with years of heavy rainfall are expected to persist in this region. Higher evapotranspiration rates are expected as well with increasing temperatures. Snowpack in this area acts as a natural reservoir that is important to summer irrigation, rangeland vegetation, and summer stream flows. Water changes limit net primary productivity and reduce grazing water sources during the summer months. Distance from water is an important limiting factor on cattle grazing distribution, and climate change is also likely to intensify issues regarding grazing in riparian areas. It is expected that water systems and water developments will need to be expanded to maintain or improve cattle distribution and to secure additional forage and feed resources. There may be opportunities for supplemental forage and feed resources during dry times in the Northwest, but we have to keep in mind competing water needs, including other agriculture, hydroelectric power generation, and protection of fish habitat. Also, areas where water is already fully allocated according to average conditions may be particularly vulnerable. I'm showing here an example of management challenges in the Northwest using the state of Oregon as an example. The areas outlined in black are counties where sage grouse are present. The dashed red areas are critical habitat for sage grouse, or what are often referred to as priority areas of conservation. This map also shows the current predicted burn probability for a large fire that is defined here as greater than 250 acres. And the highest probabilities are shown in the dark orange. We can see that these orange areas coincide with many of these high priority areas for conservation. Also, using this planning tool, I saw that these higher burn probabilities in Eastern Oregon closely mirror the extent of high annual grass and annual forb cover in the area. This helps us to understand that climate impacts are coming into a world of existing management challenges in the Northwest, including changed fire regimes, for example, related to increased fuel loads from past management. Other challenges include problems with native perennial plant establishment after fire and sage-grouse conservation. Sage-grouse depend upon sagebrush for all stages of their life cycle. And also, many of us are familiar with the impacts of invasive annual grass fire cycles, the most famous one being cheatgrass. Climate change is expected to exacerbate this problem, not only through an increased risk of fire, but also through decreased resilience of native perennials. Cheatgrass is known for its continuous and fine fuel loads, flammable earlier in the summer as it senesces earlier, and exhibits high interannual variability in response to variable precipitation, and does well with more frequent fire. In summary, we're expecting increased frequency and severity of droughts and subsequent wildfires, also changing forage and water resources over space and time due to reduced snowpack and other factors, including earlier senescence of many species, leading to diminished late season forage supplies. And finally, several compounding and interacting ecological and social impacts and drivers of change are expected. Climate change adaptation practices can help by proactively reducing impacts expected from extreme events. Preparing for extreme disturbance in particular may be helpful. Sometimes large and severe fires, for example, come through and land managers have to spend a great deal of time or other resources restoring vegetation and also rebuilding infrastructure. Fire is a natural part of these systems. However, fire that has long-lasting negative impacts on the soils and vegetation and affect the ability for the vegetation to recover is a problem for many reasons, including high costs and low effectiveness of restoration. Also, recovery and restoration in these cases may take away resources needed to prepare for disturbances in the future. This provides a sense of urgency and preparation so that we can avoid getting stuck reacting to urgent situations in a moment at the expense of being able to plan ahead and create more resilient systems. Wildfire and drought preparation are important opportunities. Here I'll review some climate adaptation strategies, starting with fire. The climate adaptation approach here is to ensure that plant communities can be resilient to periodic fire. For example, fire in some sagebrush communities can wipe out sagebrush vegetation over large areas and precipitate huge increases in invasive annual grasses. This may increase the likelihood of reburns and or additional annual grass establishment. Pre-fire methods to reduce potential severity could be critical for resiliency of these systems and for maintaining sage-grouse habitat. One example strategy I have listed here is to minimize fire severity prior to invasive annual grass dominance. Some example practices include planning and preparing for a greater burn area. This can include managing for large areas to promote defendable fire breaks and fuel reduction strategies. Also considering, and a second example is considering fuel treatments, especially after high production years in some sagebrush communities, and anticipating impending drought and subsequent wildfire risks is important as well. Another area for preparation in this area is for drought. The overall adaptation approach given here is water, soil, and soil water retention. An example strategy is to retain soil moisture for native shrubs, forbs, and grasses. And the example practice given is to manage juniper expansion. And we know that conifer expansion has been talked about in other talks into rangeland. It has been an important issue in this area for the last 100 years or more, but is increasingly problematic in the presence of extreme droughts, increasing evaporative demand due to increasing temperatures, and also reduced seasonal soil moisture as a result of reduced snowpack. One study of Central Oregon that modeled projected climate change impacts found that juniper treatments in cool, moist sagebrush steppe substantially reduce the rate of juniper encroachment, particularly when prioritized early in the century. A little more about drought preparation. Same adaptation approach with another example strategy to retain and improve perennial vegetation and healthy soils to improve water holding capacity. Maintaining or some example practices are maintaining or increasing soil organic matter and plant vigor and diversity. For example, planting climate adapted native grasses as a preventive measure in areas of concern for invasive annual grasses may be feasible primarily on smaller scales like private lands, if not cost prohibitive. A second example is to plan and invest to manage distribution, timing, intensity, and duration of grazing, which comes up a lot in the literature. However, it likely requires investment in things like infrastructure and or labor. So for example, fencing and or virtual fencing or range riders, water tanks, piping systems, and upland vegetation monitoring, as well as on public lands, considering longer term planning for things like investment in water tanks. The NEPA process for water tanks, for example, can take 3 to 5 years. Investments in upland water tanks, however, may also help to reduce time cattle spend in riparian areas by providing additional water sources and may potentially reduce drought impacts on livestock production and other ungulates. Climate change adaptation does not mean that common ecosystem management practices are no longer appropriate. Rather, the prioritization and spatial extent of those practices will likely change in anticipation of climate impacts. For example, managers may shift more of their resources towards better preparation for wildfire or drought in areas with lower levels of exotic annual grass invasion. In conclusion, rangeland management issues in the Northwest are growing and becoming increasingly complex with interacting factors such as drought, fire, and invasive annual grass species. There's an increased sense of urgency and also opportunity for management under climate change, as degradation cycles are likely to happen more frequently and potentially at faster rates. As we just discussed, there are actions land managers can take to prepare. There are also important practices for disturbance response and restoration, which will be presented in this synthesis paper. I also didn't have time to discuss this connect piece, which refers to connections and is shown at the bottom of the diagram, as this can create the foundation for climate adaptation. This means connecting with different knowledge sources, community organizations, and collaboratives, establishing long-term science management partnerships, and so on. For example, there is a growing recognition of the contribution that local, indigenous, and or professional knowledge contribute to scientific knowledge and natural resource management. The ability to connect can inform and support the where, the when, and the how of these climate adaptation practices. Also, connecting through collaborative efforts have benefits beyond knowledge sharing, including trust building, increasing collaborative capacity, and increasing the pace of learning. Better, more informed and inclusive climate adaptation prioritization through these connections I just described are also critical to striking a balance. By balance, I mean a balance between adaptive responses and planning ahead using climate change information. Also a balance between flexibility and accountability. Flexibility has been talked about a bit here today. It is so important with fluctuating forage production and greater uncertainty with sudden drought or wildfire. However, attaining flexibility can be difficult, especially on public lands, and establishing the necessary level of accountability is key. There are some important management examples of accountable and flexible approaches that I touch on in this synthesis. In preparing for extreme drought and wildfire or other climate change impacts, the rangeland community may very well find great commonality in goals, opportunities for the coordination of resources, and alignment of values. My hope is that by focusing more on preparation and connections, the rangeland community can also come together to respond most effectively during extreme disturbance, as well as restore and prepare again after the fire has gone out and the rain has come back. Thank you for taking the time to learn with me today. I'd like to thank my co-authors, as well as many others that have provided their support and guidance on this project. Happy to answer any questions. I also have some great resources for anyone who is interested and have included a few of them here, which I will just flash briefly on the screen, but I'm happy to connect more.
Thank you, Anna. And those resources, because this is being recorded, people can find those when we get the recording posted.
Great. Thank you, Joel.
All right. So thank you, Anna. Special thanks to all the presenters. You guys did a really nice job. We are exactly on time. So now we do have some time for discussion. And if you've got something, if you got a question you'd like to ask, or a comment that you'd like to have a response to, put it in the chat and I will get it out there for the speakers. I'll start out. I've got a couple of things that kind of popped up during the presentation that kind of cut across all of the authors. And in particular, one thing that kind of jumped out to me was during the second half of the presentations, when we started talking about more about the socio ecological aspects of it. In Haley's talk, ranchers felt like they felt confident in their ability to manage ecology. They felt like they had more practices in the thing that Leslie showed, same thing with Anna. But yet when we look at the data that Ken showed, that Duroc showed, we're not seeing any improvements out there. And in many cases, we're seeing declines in the ecological conditions. So is there a disconnect between what we think land managers know and what land managers think they know and what's really coming out on the ground, or what the monitoring data is telling us? Obviously, anybody that would like to take that one on, feel free. Okay, if nobody's going to volunteer, I'll call on someone. Haley, that was your data that I referred to specifically. Would you care to respond to that? Okay, Haley may be on another, I think she had 2 symposia scheduled this morning. Duroc has got his hand up. Duroc, please go ahead.
Hey, I'm happy to bail us out here. So,
Or dig us in deeper.
Yeah, I might. I think it's a great point. You can see it throughout the themes. There's, I mean, when we're talking about the challenges of transformation on big scale issues like these, it's not like when we're talking about global change drivers and we're the living experiment. So the connection between theory and practice is, I think, really what you're hitting on, that, and Leslie did a really nice job showing that as well. So one of my favorite questions I would always ask in discussions tied to resilience is like, well, show me what successful resilience actually looks like. Because we'd see where we're applying, say, adaptive management, to try and benefit that, or where we have these demonstration sites or case studies, but long-term proven success is really hard. And that was even with more local issues, let alone global change drivers. So we're talking about the theory and pathways to actually guide transformation in the face of those kind of threats. We're basically being tested as a profession of how good we are. And so if we can we have seen where there's groups, just like Heidi was talking about, that have risen, that have had scales of success and more beneficial outcomes than what we've tracked in the past. So there are successful examples out there, but they're so exceedingly rare. And I really liked what Brandon set up, because that determines, that RAD framework. Like, you can't really resist global change pressures if you don't have the cultural will to do it. So Heidi and Leslie were really talking about that cultural will aspect and how to help reinforce it, let alone the guidance and resources and sufficient external capacity to support that willpower. So it's definitely not going to be easy, but we are seeing some signs of success out there. But by and large, yeah, I think it is good for us to take a step back and say, well, wait a minute, how good are we at the profession? Are we adapting sufficiently enough? Or is the old habits and what we used to prioritize going to work this century, given we've got novel pressures and change? So a great overview, I think, by the group to try and frame like the challenge we have going forward.
Okay, thank you. Brandon, go ahead.
Just to follow up on that point, Durak, I think it's also important for us as we think about climate change to define and maybe redefine what success is. It was interesting from the Restore New Mexico data that some of the treatments that we saw where shrubs were removed with herbicides didn't increase grasses, but the controls, the grasses decreased. So we may be, fighting against a tide, and we're expecting things to change back to what they were, but maybe in a lot of cases, just trying to stay where we're at, even if it's not what we hope it would be, is good enough, or is as good as we can expect.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. There is a question from Claire Hydock. Nobody mentioned environmental groups. Do any of the collaborative groups have buy-in from them? Or are they, or were they invited to be part of those groups?
So Joel, I'll just grab this from in all of our work, we include all of the stakeholders on rangelands, those folks with vested interests in the sustainability and conservation of these landscapes. So that includes environmental and conservation groups. I don't know what specific groups they're asking about, but yeah, I mean, Nature Conservancy, Audubon, California, Point Blue Conservation, Defenders of Wildlife, all these different groups we have worked with over the years, because they do bring a really important perspective to these conversations as well.
So without going into specifics, I think I'm fairly familiar with most of those, most of the people involved in these presentations. And I think environmental groups, as well as, the traditional conservation districts and all of that, all had a lot of involvement from not necessarily from landowners, but from the interested public.
And I didn't bring it in because we don't have 3 hours for each presentation, but some previous work that we had done in terms of collaborative adaptive management, we were able to really see and demonstrate the value of not just the traditional rangeland users, but also environmental groups working together to help connect different goals and methods in terms of reaching different objectives. And we saw that, those groups that were mixed groups, including environmental ranching and rangeland professional type groups, those groups made more connections, between methods and practices to reach a stated goal than the groups that were more insular or, were, just a single type of rangeland stakeholder. So it's a good point to ask about.
Okay. Thank you. Haley, I noticed that you're back. I've got a question for you that came up a little bit earlier. And I'll, without going into great detail, I'll summarize it. Are we overrating ourselves in our abilities, both as professionals and land managers, to respond to these pressures?
I think that our social science would suggest there's a lot of opportunity for us to just see the bigger scales and think about them. It doesn't mean we can't do anything. When I was talking to Peter Adler about my presentation, he said, so we have to solve all of society's problems just to work on climate adaptation. That just doesn't seem like we're going to get anywhere. And that really made me think. And I thought, well, no, but we could at least talk about it. We could at least talk about it. And so the point I think I was trying to drive home is, we can get really good at even grazing association or national forest scale of adaptive management. And we can use all the science, but we still have these social challenges. And what are we really doing about them? And what creative ideas do folks have? And that's why I like that idea of imagination from sociology. That's kind of what science can do. I get a lot of grief. You guys have heard me present. I'm a first generation PhD. So when I go home to my folks, they're like, what do? You just sit around and think of new stuff and we pay you to do that. But kind of, I think there's a place where range science can really start to imagine a different future. Let's run these scenarios. Let's talk about whether it's policy or collaborations or research or action or education, the things that we can do. Because ranchers are really good at being ranchers. They're really good at keeping baby calves alive. They're really good at managing and understanding some of these rangeland ecology issues. I don't see a lot of overgrazing. These bigger challenges are going to take some other tools, and so let's just talk about it, I guess, is kind of the point that I'm trying to get across. I don't know what y'all think though.
Aaron Miller has a hand up. Aaron, question?
Yeah, hi, Joel, thanks. Just to comment on how we talk about things, I feel like in a lot of cases, we're not being completely transparent or honest about the way that we talk about certain functions, such as, I'll use the example of in a state and transition model, we often include the arrow to some kind of state one or a reference state, and that arrow represents a pathway or transition that involves building back organic matter or soil organic matter or soil organic carbon or topsoil. But at least here in the Southwest, that's not really something that happens. Doesn't matter how you change your management. These are things that don't really occur on human timescales. And often we include these in our conversations or a list of things you can do to improve your land management or to become more resilient for climate change. But those are, I guess, I'm not sure how transparent we're being in how practical or feasible something like that really is. I guess, I don't know if anybody else has a similar feeling about that. I'd be curious to hear what others think.
Okay, Aaron, I think that's a very good point, and that's one that I think we can, I think we've got everything that we need to address those issues right there in front of us. We've got the way to communicate. We've got the pathways to communicate. We certainly have the receptive audience, and we've got the knowledge. So, all the tools are there. Maybe it's just a matter of how we deploy them. So with that question, that leaves me just enough time to again, thank all of the participants, the audience. We had almost 100 people at one point. I very much appreciate everyone's respect for the speakers and managing your devices there, and making sure that we came off on time. Thanks to the speakers. Outstanding presentations, very much addressing the topic and the questions, as well as a really nice job of presenting to the subject and within the time frame that we've been allotted. So thank everybody. Like we said, this is being recorded and it will be posted in several places. So I think we've got something to go ahead with, and I'm going to call this one successful. So thank you, and we'll see you later.